Okay, we are going to kick this off with a debate which will tackle one of the most pressing questions in the energy transition. How do we fairly allocate the costs of maintaining and upgrading the energy system? Our panellists will explore the challenges of balancing affordability, equity and investment needs. This will be a debate between two teams on the topic, energy is a public good, so network costs should be covered by public taxes. So nearly half of your energy bill goes towards paying for your energy network. Network costs may likely rise in the future so that we can reach net zero. If energy is an essential service, should the infrastructure costs associated with providing that service be paid through taxes? Would that lead to a more equitable and fair society? Or would energy network costs blow out if households didn't pay for these costs in their bills? Let's hear what our debaters have to say. Our teams are, for our first affirmative, we have Jill Caney, Director of Earn Energy. Jill's a climate scientist with particular focus on community energy resilience. Our second affirmative speaker is Craig Memory, Energy Policy. I've lost the ability to speak. This is a problem for an MC. Energy Policy Advocate for the Justice and Equity Centre. You may remember them as PIAC. Craig's a long-standing consumer advocate as well in this area. And then on the negative team, we have first Dean Spacavento, the Chief Executive Officer for Reposit Power, who are an energy retailer that offers households with solar panels and battery systems guaranteed no electricity bills for 7 years. And then following that, we have, finally, we have Ian McGill, who will be our final speaker. And Ian is a professor of the School of Electrical Engineering and Telecommunications for UNSW Sydney. All right, so to kick off our debate, please welcome, and we're going to have Q&A afterwards, so you can put your questions into the... look, as a traditional debater, that's not part of a traditional debate. This is against how debates work, okay? But I'm willing to let it go this once, okay? Put your questions into the slider and we'll ask them afterwards. And we will get you also to vote at the end who is the winner. Okay, we're not going to wait for Albo to go to the Governor-General and say when the election is. The election of this will be afterwards, okay? So, to start the debate, please welcome to the stage Jill Caney.
Well, so I think we're all agreed that electricity is an essential service, and currently consumers have no choice over the electricity network to which they are connected. I mean, one day maybe that will happen. And the way that some consumers use the network has changed, but the way that we fund the network strangely hasn't changed with all this transition going on. And if you can invest in a battery or an EV, it is possible to avoid those new solar tax charges that the networks have brought in, but not everyone can do that. And the way we use the network will continue to evolve, but DNSPs have showed little evolution in the way that they fund their business models. Now, inequalities still exist between those that can afford to divorce the DNSP and those that have to, unfortunately, stay with the DNSP. So charging consumers the network costs on the basis of the electricity they use is no longer fit for purpose. Now, as you know, I like to talk about apples a lot when I come to this forum, and I'm going to talk a bit about apples again. So the electricity meter, it's doing a lot of hard work. Every time an apple goes through the meter, it's carrying the costs of the distribution network, the transmission network, AEMO, pretty much everything, and decarbonisation incentives and approaches. And it's also not the major thing carrying the cost of the electricity that you use in the house or your business. The electricity, the apple, that passes through the meter is no longer a true representation of the costs to maintain and operate the bigger Apple network system. The apples may have come from your next door neighbour, from their own apple tree in the back garden. They may have come from the next suburb, and sometimes they may have come from the great big orchards in the next state. But regardless, that apple carries the full cost of the network whether it came from next door or whether it came from somewhere else. Network costs represent a big proportion of the bill, and they are costs that consumers aren't able to control. Networks will be transforming how they operate on a physical basis and as a business, and removing those costs from the apple removes the risks and the costs that consumers have to pay, and they just have to look after the energy costs. So if you like, the electricity meter is just measuring the cost of the energy that you're using, and you can control that. The tax system already incorporates an assessment of the ability to pay. So by funding networks through the tax rather than the energy used, we're allowing customers to have an electricity bill that actually reflects how they use their electricity, and we empower them to change how they use that. They have no control over the big Apple system and how apples come and go. So let's just have the electricity meter do the job that it's meant to do, which is monitor how much energy you use. And yes, it would be lovely if we could share that data directly in real time locally with the customer, but that doesn't seem to be the way we're going at the moment. And yes, we put networks on the tax base, and then if they get their act together or don't get their act together, customers are carrying that cost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. Great talk there. I have not seen a talk so focused on apples since the Garden of Eden chat. It's great to see there. Dean Spacavento is our next speaker, presumably to talk about oranges.
Good afternoon, everybody. A Federal Treasury document published 2 months ago called the Tax Expenditures and Insights Statement found that between 55 and 80% of revenue foregone by the Australian Tax Office in 2025 was attributable to the top 20% of income earners in the country. That's $110 billion for less than 5 million people in a country of, 27, 28 million people? It was primarily made up, in order, superannuation concessions, capital gains tax discounts, and rental losses, otherwise known as negative gearing. For this reason, just to begin with, I'm going to argue that it's simply unfair for the cost of our electricity networks to be met by the public taxation system. How does it make sense to use a system that so clearly favours high income earners to spread the cost of our electricity networks more equitably? The highest income earners have already demonstrated that they're much more able to minimise the amount of tax they pay than pretty much everybody else. The proposal by my opponents would at best hand the top 20% of income earners thousands of dollars a year in lower electricity bills, and at worst their proposal would make the housing crisis even worse. Why? Because the top 3 tax deductions, super concessions, capital gains tax discounts and negative gearing, are most often used by individuals to invest in housing. In fact, these mechanisms are specifically designed to make investors taking a loss on owning a home more palatable so that they can make money when they flip the home. This basically pushes up the housing prices for investors looking to make profits. So look, I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with this story, and I think, no, let's not pay for our electricity networks with the taxation system. It is fundamentally a bad idea. Making things fairer is a good idea, though, but what does it even mean here? I'm not going to resort to apples. I argue that fair means that those people who use more of the resources of the electricity network should pay more. Simple as that. Actually more, not tax-deductibly more. The electricity network's resources are not used up by moving electricity. Moving electricity doesn't wear out the network. The resources of the network are used up by people who are using powerful machines to crowd out other people from getting energy off the network or to put energy into the network. And because everybody needs electricity, the network companies then spend money to make sure that people aren't crowded out and everyone can use the network. Electricity costs go up whenever electricity companies spend money to build the network. The people with the powerful machines that barge in all over the top of everybody else, causing electricity prices to go up, these big machines, we need them to reduce carbon emissions. They are what are going to get us off fossil fuels and gas, et cetera, et cetera. Things like EVs and heat pumps, solar batteries, induction cookers, solar systems. Regulators know this already and introduced demand charges to try and stop the overcrowding some time ago. But demand charges punish normal people for doing very normal electricity use. A fairer system would be one of upfront informed agreement and then enforcement if required. The nice thing is that these powerful machines that, let's face it, wealthier people are buying are not things you buy at the shops. You buy toasters and you buy kettles and pie makers at the shops. You don't buy EV chargers or solar systems. These powerful machines are sold, installed, and sometimes operated by technical people who understand exactly how powerful they are and what their impact on the network is going to be. So here's my argument. People selling, installing and operating these machines should be made at least partially financially responsible for the crowding that they create or alleviate. You can't ask the average electricity consumer to be financially responsible for something that they have little chance of easily understanding, which is what demand charges ask. But you can hold those responsible who must understand what it's going to take on the network to sell and install and operate these machines. So you say, oh, surely this would be very hard to build, extremely costly, we have to change the whole grid, et cetera, et cetera. I can hear you thinking it. No, this exists already. It has for 3 years. It is all around you right now if you live in Sydney. Consumers from multiple retailers are regularly added to it. It's won an award from the Electricity Networks Association. It wasn't expensive to build. It isn't costly to operate. It required a small single rule exemption. It is called Project Edith. It was built by my company in collaboration with Ausgrid. So Reposit and Ausgrid built this to begin with. We did it for lots of reasons. Finding a fairer way to pay for the electricity network was one of them. Type it into Google, Project Edith. You'll find plenty of information about it, how it works, that it does work, and where the project's at. Project Edith is based on continuous agreement between parties that can meaningfully agree on technical things, like power consumption. Project Edith holds the right people accountable. Project Edith creates the right incentives for the owners of powerful machines. Project Edith is fair. And unlike the tax system, Project Edith ensures that those who use more of the electricity network's resources pay more, not less, of the increasing cost of our changing electricity networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Spacavento there. Wasn't that a very lucky coincidence that his company just happened to have come up with a solution to all of these problems? That was very lucky. That was very lucky that was the case there. Unfortunately, you didn't learn from Bill Shorten in the election, and that is if you attacked rich boomers' tax concessions for super CGT and negative gearing, you automatically lose. So unfortunately, we're going to rule that out. Our next speaker is Craig Memories, second speaker for the affirmative.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thanks everyone. I'll just acknowledge that we're on unceded Gadigal lands before I start. My very, very dear friends, I think that's everyone. I stand before you today with regret and remorse. Not just because I'm on a stage that has twice as many Craigs as it does women. But the source of my shame is that in my 15 years representing you, the energy consumers of Australia, my efforts on tariff reform have come to naught. I share Dean's ambitions for the changes that we need to make. In fact, I've invested thousands of unrecoverable hours promoting exactly those reforms to our tariff system. But as Einstein said in defining insanity, quote, as doing the same tariff workshops over and over again and expecting a different result. I have failed, and I realise now that we need to not only shift recovery of network costs to government taxes, but use this once in an electoral cycle opportunity to revolutionise energy offerings, to overhaul our antiquated taxation system and supercharge energy market governance, and rethink how we even do democracy. First, on to those new offerings. Now, Sure, as Ben has indicated, we may well be poised to supercharge the development of consumer energy resources with more efficient user-pays system of cost recovery, and tariff reforms coming through could deliver that. I mean, he didn't say it quite succinctly, but that was basically the point that he was getting to. But I ask you to think of the bigger picture, the bigger, integrated, smaller, modular picture of what governments could do with energy taxes. For decades, Tasmanian households have had access to heat on a hydro tariff, reflecting the flexible and efficient energy resource that makes Tassie the battery of our nation. Other states have had peak hot water to squeeze the most value out of overnight cheap coal fuel. Now, those initiatives have all been driven by governments, not by industry. Now, with full government control of energy cost recovery, people could opt for a new power tax, a clear power tax, a new clear power tax. A nuclear power tax where you simply flick a switch, your tax bill goes up 10 times more than you expected, and voila, 40 years later the light comes on. Nonetheless, I would like to express my furious agreement with the last speaker regarding his concerns about the tax system, and I suggest we use this opportunity to overhaul the tax system. Now, obviously, we would need to bake some rewards into the tax system to incentivise people to help themselves and others use less energy, because if we didn't have some sort of signal, people could just use energy quite profligately. That would be done in the form of tax rebates and deductions, not unfamiliar to the way our system works. It is actually, in my experience, again, doing advocacy, it's been a real struggle to get people just to insulate their homes on the energy bill savings alone. But everyone loves a tax offset. So imagine if the most appealing way we could take advantage of the terrible weaknesses of our tax system was with a portfolio of efficient appliances, solar and batteries, rather than property. Energy efficiency and consumer energy resources could become the new negative gearing, and only actually improving the housing market rather than decimating it and locking everyone out. That's one option. Another is if we really wanted to make it an accurate energy-based tax system, we could do away with the income-based taxation system altogether and recover all of our PAYG tax through our meter reads. We would need, obviously, to have an inclining block taxation system to keep it progressive, but it can all be done. And just think, we could even replace export charges with an actual sun tax rather than the pretend one that we currently have. Finally, on to rethinking our energy market governance and democracy. Now, at the core of our democracy and our democratic system is our democratic system of government, where two major parties take it in turns to run the country. Two major parties take it in turns to run the country into the ground. Now, these governments are primarily appointed on the basis of a complex system of preferential voting while making pre-election promises for bill reductions that for some reason never seem to materialise. Now, on the other hand, the core of our energy system are independent, rigorous regulator, commission, market operator, who, if we make this reform, will suddenly have a whole lot more time on their hands. So why don't we do away with this whole preferential voting malarkey and run our elections as reverse auctions on energy bills? Then, with all the spare time the energy regulator has, with not having to determine these tedious tariff structure statements every few years for every network, blah, 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 we can extend their reach to government monitoring, and they can ensure the promised reductions are passed through in determining the DMO, or default ministerial offer, to make sure that we all receive those promised developments. And look, in closing, I'm not one to make ad hominem attacks, but I would also note that despite the uncertainty and admittedly untransparent ties that the against side has with the US, I would ask, you know who else prefers tariffs over taxes, right?
Thank you very much, Craig. Now, you may be wondering why I'm standing up and then going behind here is because I laughed so hard at nuclear power tax that my glasses fell off the back here. So just please welcome to the stage our fourth speaker, Ian McGill.
Okay, how are people going? Persuaded one way or the other? My first sort of topic for discussion is actually debating itself. And I just want to do a little poll. Could you put your hand up if you did school debating? Okay. Now, keep your hands up, please. Hands up if you did school debating. Now my question is, keep your hand up. So look around. Keep your hand up if you're now part of what you might call the professional persuader class, okay? So you're in media, or you're in government, or you're a lawyer, or you're in comms, or... Yeah, okay. So there was a great article in the Sydney Morning Herald 9 years ago by a guy who's now a journalist at the Canberra Times. At the time he was a Year 11 schoolboy. And his article in the Sydney Morning Herald was titled, "How School Debating Has Ruined Australian Politics." Okay? And there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, look at the extremes which people go to, right? And it's basically, you have to take an extreme position on something you probably don't believe in, right? Okay? So, we've got some good perspectives, but the key thing we need to be thinking about is of course, it's a spectrum, right? Okay, we're very tariff-focused here in Australia, but there's public taxes going to, I don't know, rural regional customers in Queensland, about $500 million a year. Okay, we've just got the federal government cost of living, payments coming out of tax. So it's clearly a mix of the two, right? So it's a question about where you sit on that spectrum. And I don't think we should be arguing it's all just move it to taxes or it should all just be sitting in tariffs. It's clearly going to be a spectrum of those two. Okay. Oh, yeah. I've got 15 minutes according to that timer. Anyway, that's great. So keep me in line, Craig. Craig 1. All right.
You got 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. So, let's think about it. The average household, look, it's around $1,200 on network tariffs a year, very, very roughly, right? And your typical household, it's hard to estimate, but it's about $50,000 of taxes a year, typical household, right? So at one level you say, okay, well, network tariffs, move it into tax, what is it, another, 1,200, 2, 3, 4%. It's clearly doable, right? And there's lots of ways you could do, as Craig was highlighting, which would make it work better. Okay? So, it's not about whether you can do it, it's about whether you should do it. All right? So, let's unpick the topic. Energy is a public good. Well, if you ask the public what a public good is, they tend to focus on it benefits society, it's provided by government often, it's available to everyone. If you ask an economist, they say, no, a public good means that it's non-excludable, you can't stop people getting access to it, and it's non-rivalrous, which means your use of the public good doesn't impact on anybody else's. That's clearly not network services, right? Okay, people are excluded. They get disconnected, or even worse, they're on pay-as-you-go meters and they have to disconnect themselves when they can't afford it, right? And rivalrous, well, a lot of the time there's a lot of room on the network, but there are times when there's a lot of rivalry for who gets network, right? So it's not strictly a public good. In fact, the economists call it a merit good or even a club good, okay? So, we've kind of pulled that apart. Let's now just think about why would we choose where to sit on that spectrum of public taxes versus network tariffs, right? So let's think equity fairness. I mean, Dean did a great job. They love to say our tax system's progressive, but then there's all these ways people get out of paying tax, and income tax is only 40% of the take anyway, and 20% is corporate tax, and if you think corporate tax is progressive, you haven't paid attention, and you pay more tax than many of our large energy resource players, right? Because they don't pay any, okay? So our tax system has some pretty serious problems. Now, what about tariffs? Are they progressive? Well, it depends on the tariffs, doesn't it? I mean, if you think about a fixed daily charge, is there anything less progressive than that? That's Margaret Thatcher's poll tax right there, right? Okay, completely unavoidable if you're connected. Same, everyone, same amount per day. But you can have tariffs which are progressive. So, yeah, you're sick of sitting in workshops. If you think tariff reform's hard, try tax reform, right? And let's see how you go. And, well, I don't know, capital gains, you know, all the support for investors in housing. It's going to be hard to move. All right. The other argument is around efficiency. And the key point, as Dean really highlighted, is you can do, you know, end users, consumers can do things on networks that make network costs go down and network value go up. So you want them engaged, right? Now, maybe you can give them all sorts of rebates and so on, but maybe another part of that is going to be tariffs, isn't it, right? Okay, so where do we end up with all of this? Oh, look, we're going to argue no or negative, but it's negative but, right? Because it's not enough to say tariffs are better than public taxation. It's what tariffs and how do they work and what behaviours do they drive and support and facilitate and encourage and which ones don't. So that's the real task ahead of us, isn't it? Now, I want to make a closing comment. I was trying to think of a hard-hitting finish, right? And what came to mind was very simple, used with devastating effect in the Voice referendum last year and used with devastating effect in the Republican, 1999, wasn't it, right? Malcolm Turnbull and all of that. It's if you don't know, vote no, right? It's very powerful. And it's about status quo, isn't it, right? Take the status quo over some uncertain thing. Do not vote no or negative on the Slido with some view around status quo is better. Because if you think the status quo is working right now for just clean energy transition, you really need to go out and open your eyes because we are really, really struggling. And we're going very, very badly, right? So, to conclude, I'm open to tariffs, I'm open to taxes. I want the system, it's going to be a mix of both. I want it to work towards fair and just energy transition. And so when you think about voting on the Slido, what we really should have up there perhaps is yes but or no but. And let's focus very much on that but bit of trying to make this work. So, thanks very much.
Thank you, Ian. All right, let's focus on the but bit now because we're going to answer the questions that have been coming through. Put your question into Slido. And look, because as Ian pointed out, debating has ruined the world. During this part, you don't have to stick to your sides, okay? You can answer the questions genuinely so we can have a proper conversation here. So the first question is, ACCC finds customers on... No, it's just changed. ACCC finds customers on hardship have higher consumption. They also have less to invest in energy-saving tech. How is it fair that they pay more? Anyone want to jump on that one? Yeah, just go to the mic.
I don't have an answer for this. How is it fair they pay more? Look, if you're on hardship, your life is pretty rough. Like, you don't choose not to pay your electricity bill. Most people are struggling to pay their electricity bill. I think once you end up in hardship, you need to be taken outside of the usual user pays of any kind of description, and I think it need to be dealt with like in a compassionate, different way.
But doesn't this go to the question of saying, well, taking it out of a tariff system and putting it as part of the tax system or having the government pay for it is a better approach than what we currently have there? I mean, what would be the change you'd make to the current system to actually make it work then?
I think it needs one small change. We just need to start taxing billionaires and it's all sorted.
I mean, the last session talked about nationalising all the energy. This is a real communist group here, okay? Yeah, that's part of the problem. I mean, and on that front here, another question is, aluminium smelters get exemptions while consuming 10 to 15% of our electricity, while so many small consumers struggle. How is such a consumer-funded model okay? How do we end up in this position?
Might be worth pointing out that aluminium smelters are also tax-funded taxpayer funded and consumer funded in their work because they're pretty heavily subsidised in what they're doing. So they've got a bit from column A, a bit from column B.
I mean, this is one of the questions, though. If we actually moved it to a tax-based system, would it be any more progressive than the current system we have?
No, you saw what happens with the tax-based system. People dodge it. Like, that is the issue. If you create additional incentive by making tax 4% more than it was before, you've just created, I don't know if it's linear or not, but let's call it linear, 4% additional incentive to dodge tax. You're going to end up in the same or worse place. And when they dodge tax, they use the tricks that go into housing. We've seen that.
But
You
you can dodge tariffs currently. You buy a battery.
Tell me how.
Well, so if you can afford it, you buy a battery, you buy an EV, you put solar on, you divorce the distribution network, and you minimise what you pay back in tariffs, and you minimise all your contributions.
And that's one of the big challenges at the moment with the justice question is obviously that the people have more money. I mean, I've done a lot of those things. I now pay extremely little for my electricity, you know. It's fantastic, but I am very aware that, yes, other than that kind of daily charge, I am getting out of the paying for the network costs. So is that one of the concerns? Let's put aside the debate. Can anyone on the panel come up, what's a better model now? What is it seriously, what would you do to kind of make a fairer model right now in terms of who should pay for the transition?
The problem is that we meter energy going past the meter, right? And it's not what the network is. The network is a capacity system, not an energy system. And so people who, like me and you, who have like a battery and a solar system and an EV and whatever, are using the grid for backup. That's why it's there, right? And we don't pay for any consumption, and so we get the grid for free, but that's because the tariffs are screwed. Like, the tariffs should be taxing.
But aren't we paying for the grid through the daily charge? That's what we're paying. You know, we're still paying the...
Most of it goes to the retailer.
Most of that goes to the retailer. All right. So I'm still asking, what's the better system? How do we make this a fair system now?
I think I just articulated that, didn't I?
I haven't searched Project Edith yet, but I presume that's where I find the answer.
One of the challenges to the current tariff system at a network level is that it remains uncost reflective, and it's not beneficiary pays reflective either. And that's based on some very long-standing and important social needs, as well as old-fashioned metering ideals and ideas. So we have a very volumetric-based recovery, which doesn't reflect, as Dean's point is, that the capacity in the network is really what drives the cost. So you can do something which is great for the environment and good for your own pocket, like investing in solar. We need more of that. But only the people who can afford to do that, I mean, the people who can afford to do that get a bit of a free kick because they're reducing their network component cost by more than they're reducing their impact on the system. This is what I've been fighting against for 15 years, not just singling out solar, but used to be air conditioners that was the problem with. In the future, with electrification, which is an important step in itself, people who remain on gas will be paying a bit less for their electric components as well. Problem is that all those reforms, despite years, they've gone nowhere, so I'm adamant that I'm going to give up on that. I almost forgot which side I was on. I'm going to give up on that and continue to fight for taxation-based cost recovery.
Is there a better way, rather than doing taxation, to just pay for the infrastructure? Is there a better way of saying, how do we get the benefits to other people? So, for instance, we use taxation, we use the government money to ensure that every single social housing has battery and solar power on it. Every single renter is part of an incentive system whereby the incentive for the landlord and the renter line up so that you absolutely have solar in that. So you actually make it so that those benefits that those who can afford those things are actually put aside to everyone else. Is that a way of doing it through the tax system, through the government system?
Yeah, like I think if you're on hardship and you keep on being on hardship and you're actually trying really hard, someone should come and put a solar and battery on your house.
I agree.
Yeah, and I think what it speaks to, isn't it, is that we've got a design challenge around all of the supporting stuff outside tariffs as well as the tariff design piece. So tariff discussions without thinking about that broader framing are really, really problematic because if you do the tariff reform but not all the other changes that actually support vulnerable consumers and others to actually be able to manage these changes, then all you end up is with tariff systems which might look economically more efficient, but which can be really problematic on equity and fairness grounds. And I mean, tariff design's always been a social construct. The introduction of a more economic framing for it is really pretty recent. And every time people go on about solar subsidies, yeah, absolutely, but think city-country, right? Huge cross-subsidies between city and country in terms of network costs. You ask the public, do they support it? Many of them say they do. People in the country cousins, they have a right to have access to electricity without it being unaffordable. It's just baked in, it's built in there. So we've got to be very realistic about the social construct piece of tariffs as well as these so-called cost-reflective tariffs. I question how cost-reflective many of the so-called cost-reflective tariffs actually are. It's just a label, right?
So I live in the country, so I'm benefiting from all of you latte sipping metropolitan dwellers because I get, I pay the same network charge. I'd like to point out that I don't get the same service though. My network tends to fall over a bit more and I tend to have longer power outages, and for me that means I can't flush my toilet. I can't fill my kettle because my water pump isn't working. So, and on the point of moving money to put solar and batteries on those that can't afford to invest it, we really need to be thinking about energy efficiency before we, what's the point of sticking solar and batteries on, I think we described our houses as tents. That's another big thing that we solve that doesn't sit anywhere in tax or tariffs.
Absolutely. Let me now, I'm going to have the vote now. I think go to your slide if the vote, while you're voting, oh no, it's just gone. While you're voting, I'm going to get, this is the top voter question at the moment. You can all answer with a yes or a no. Could we start small by taking environmental schemes out of bills and funding them on the budget? Anyone want to jump on that while we have a vote here? So yes, this is the affirmative team on this side, the negative team on this side. And it's exciting to watch it live voting here. This is more exciting than the worm on the Channel 7 debate. This is fantastic. Oh, geez, I don't know when I can call it. I mean, this is great. I know, we are running out of time. I'm going to give it 2 more seconds. All right, it's a very close debate in the end. I'm going to give it to the affirmative. Thank you very much to all of our debaters.